Chapter 13 of The Rulers of the Lakes by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kenneth Gaghan. Chapter 13. Tandakora's Grasp. They spent 2 more days in the cave, and Tayoga's marvelous cure proceeded with the same marvelous rapidity. Robert repeatedly bathed the wound for him, and then redressed it, so the air could not get into it. The Onondaga was soon able to flex the fingers well, and then to use the arm a little. "It is sure now," he said joyfully, "that Waraiyageh and Dieskau cannot meet me before I am able to do battle." "Anyhow, they wouldn't think of fighting until you came, Tayoga," said Robert. Their spirits were very high, and they felt that they had been released from great danger, some of which they could not fathom, and they would soon leave the hollow. Action would bring relief, and they anticipated eagerly what the world outside might disclose to them. Robert collected all the arrows he had shot in the fight with the wolf pack, cleaned them, and restored them to the quiver. They also put in a plentiful supply of moose meat in their packs, and then he said, "Which way, Tayoga?" "There is but one way." "You mean we should press on toward Crown Point and find out what has become of our comrades?" "That is it. We must know how it ended, their battle with St. Luc, which entails a search through the forest. That's just what I wanted, but I don't know how you felt about it with your lame shoulder." "Tomorrow or the next day I shall be able to use a shoulder if we have to fight, but we may not meet any of the French or their allied warriors. I have no wish at all to turn back." "Then forward it is, Tayoga, and I propose that we go toward the spot where we left them in conflict. Such eyes as yours may yet find there signs that you can read. Then we'll know how to proceed." "Well spoken, Tayoga. Come, we'll go through the forest as fast as we may." The cave had been a most welcome place. It had served in turn as a home, a hospital, and a fort, and in every capacity it had served them well. But both Robert and Tayoga were intensely glad to be out again in the open world, where the winds were blowing, where the vast masses of green rested and pleased the eye, and where the rustling of leaves and the singing of birds soothed the ear. "It's wonderful and noble wilderness," said Robert. "I'm glad I'm here, even if there are French and Indians in it seeking our lives. Why, Tayoga, I can feel myself growing in such an atmosphere. Tell me, am I not an inch taller than I was when I left that hollow in the rocks?" "You do look taller," said the Onondaga, "but maybe it's because you stand erect now. Dagaeoga, since the wolves have been defeated, has become proud and haughty again. At any rate, your wonderful cure is still going on at a wonderful speed. You use your left arm pretty freely, and you seem to have back nearly all your old strength." "Yes, Tododaho still watches over me. He is far better to me than I deserve." They pushed on at a good speed, returning on the path they had taken when Tayoga received his wound, and though they slept one night on the way, to give Tayoga's wound a further chance, they came in time to the place where the rangers and the Mohawks had met St. Luc's force in combat. The heavy rains long since had wiped out all the traces of footsteps there, but Robert hoped that the keen eyes of the Onondaga would find signs to indicate which way the battle had gone. Tayoga looked a long time before he said anything. "The battle was very fierce," he said at last. "Our main force lay along here among these bushes." "How do you know that, Tayoga?" asked Robert. "It's very simple. For a long distance the bushes are shattered and broken. It was rifle balls and musket balls that did it. Indians are not usually good marksmen, and they shot high, cutting off twigs above the heads of the Mohawks and rangers. Suppose we look at the opposite ridge and the line of bushes where St. Luc's warriors must have stationed themselves." They crossed the intervening space of 60 or 70 yards, and found that the bushes there had not been cut up so much. "The rangers and Mohawks are the better marksmen," said Tayoga. "They aim lower and probably hit the target much more often. At least they did not cut off so many twigs." He walked back into the open space between the two positions, his eyes having been caught by something dark lying in a slight depression of the earth. It was part of the bushy tail of a raccoon, such as the borderers wear in their caps. "Our men charged," said the Onondaga. "Why do you say so?" asked Robert. "Because of the raccoon tail. It was shot from the cap of one of the charging men. French and Indians do not wear such a decoration. See where the bullet severed it. I think St. Luc's men must have broken and run before the charge, and we will look for evidence of it." They advanced in the direction of Champlain, and 200 or 300 yards farther on, Tayoga picked up a portion of an Indian headdress, much bedraggled. "Their flight was headlong," he said, "or the warrior would not have lost the frame and the feathers that he valued so much. It fell then before the storm, as the muddy and broken condition of the feathers shows that it was lying on the ground when the great rain came." "And here," said Robert, "is where the bullet went into the trunk of this big oak." "Which shows that the rangers and Mohawks were still pursuing closely. It is possible that the French and Indians tried to make a brief stand at this place. Let's see if we can find the track of another bullet." They discovered the paths of 2 more in the tree trunks, and saw the boughs of several shattered bushes, all leading in a line toward Crown Point. "They were not able to stand long," said Tayoga. "Our men rushed them again. This shows that they must have been in panic for a few moments." He picked up an Indian blanket, soiled and worn, from a gully. "See the mud upon it," he said. "It, too, fell before the rain, because when the flood came a stream ran in the gully, a stream that has left the blanket in this state. The warriors must have been in a tremendous haste to have lost this blanket. We know that they were routed and that the victory was ours. But it is likely that our leaders continued the pursuit toward Oneidatote and up to the walls of Crown Point itself. And if your wish be the same as mine, Dagaeoga, we will follow on." "You know, Tayoga, that I wouldn't think of anything else. But the dangers grow thick as we approach Crown Point." "Not any thicker for me than for you." "To that I can make no reply. Dagaeoga is always ready with words. But while I want to go on, I'm not in favor of taking any needless risks. I like to keep my scalp on top of my head, the place where it belongs. And so I bid you, Tayoga, use those keen ears and eyes of yours to the utmost." Tayoga laughed. "Dagaeoga is learning wisdom," he said. "A great warrior does not throw his life away. He will not walk blind through the forest. I'll do all I can with my ears, and so will you. I mean to do so. Do you see that silver flash through the tangle of foliage? Don't you think it comes from the waters of Champlain?" "Can't be doubted. Once more we see the Great Lake, and Crown Point itself is not many miles away. It is in my mind that Black Rifle, Great Bear, Mountain Wolf, Daganoweda, and our men have been scouting about, and we might meet 'em coming back. I had thought that too." They walked on toward Champlain through a forest apparently without sign of danger, and Tayoga, hearing a slight noise in a thicket, turned off to the right to see if a deer were browsing there. He found nothing, but as the sound came again from a point farther on, he continued his search, leaving his comrade out of sight behind him. The thickets were very dense, and suddenly the warnings of Tododaho came. He sprang back as quick as lightning, and doubtless he would have escaped had it not been for his wounded shoulder. He hurled off the first warrior who threw himself upon him, slipped from the grasp of a second, but was unable to move when the mighty Tandakora and another seized him by the shoulders. But in a moment of dire peril he remembered his comrade and uttered a long and thrilling cry of warning, which the huge hand of Tandakora could not shut off in time. Then, knowing he was trapped and would only injure his shoulder by further struggles, he ceased to resist, submitting passively to the binding of his arms behind him. He saw that Tandakora had 7 or 8 warriors with him, and a half a dozen more were bounding out of the trail after Robert. He heard a shot and then another, but he did not hear any yell of triumph, and he drew a long breath of relief. His warning cry had been uttered in time. Dagaeoga would know that it was folly for him also to fall into the hands of Tandakora, and he would flee at his greatest speed. So he stood erect with his wrists bound behind him, his face calm and immovable. It did not become an Onondaga taken prisoner to show emotion or, in fact, feeling of any kind before his captives. but his heart was full of anxiety as he waited for those who held him. A quarter of an hour they stood thus, and then the pursuing warriors, recognizing the vain nature of their quest, began to return. Tandakora did not upbraid them, because he was in high good humor. "Though the white youth Lennox has escaped," he said in Iroquois, "we have done well. We have here Tayoga, of the clan of the Bear, of the nation of Onondaga, of the League of the Hodenosaunee, one of our deadliest enemies. It is more than I hoped, because, though so young, he is a great warrior, skillful and brave, and we shall soon see how he can bear the live coals upon his breast." Still, Tayoga did not move, nor did he visibly shudder at the threat which he knew Tandakora meant to keep. The Ojibway has never appeared more repellent as he exulted over his prisoner. He seemed larger than ever, and his naked body was covered with paint and hideous devices. "And so I have you at last, Tayoga," he said. "Your life shall be short, but your death shall be long, and you shall have full chance to prove how much an Onondaga can bear." "Whether it be much or little," said Tayoga, "it would be more than any Ojibway can endure." The black eyes of Tandakora flashed angrily, and he struck Tayoga heavily in the face with his open palm. The Onondaga staggered, but recovered himself, and gazed steadily into the eyes of the Ojibway. "You have struck a bound captive, O Tandakora," he said. "It is contrary to the customs of your nation and of mine. For it I shall have your life. It is now written that you shall fall by my hand." His calm tones and the fearless gaze with which he met that of Tandakora gave him all the aspect of a prophet. The huge Ojibway flinched for a moment, and then he laughed. "If it is written that I am to die by your hand, it is written falsely," he said, "because before another sun is set, all chance of it will be gone." "I have said that you will die by my hand, and I say it again. It is written," repeated Tayoga firmly. Though he showed no emotion, there was much mortification in the soul of the young Onondaga. He had practically walked into the hands of Tandakora, and he felt that, for the present at least, there was a stain upon his skill as a forest runner. The blow of Tandakora's had left its mark, too, upon his mind. He had a part of the Christian doctrine of forgiveness, but it could not be applied so deadly and evil an enemy as the Ojibway. To such an insult offered to a helpless prisoner, the reply could only be made with weapons. Although Tododaho from his star, invisible by day, whispered to him to be of good heart, Tayoga was torn by conflicting beliefs. He was going to escape, and yet escape seemed impossible. The last of the warriors had gone on the trail of young Lennox had come in, and he was surrounded now by more than a dozen stalwart men. The promise of Tododaho grew weak, although his figure remained firm and upright, and his look was calm and brave. He saw no possibility of escape. He thought of Daganoweda and of the Mohawks and Rangers, but the presence of Tandakora and his men indicated they had gone back toward the army of Waraiyageh and were perhaps with him now. He thought of St. Luc, but he did not know whether the gallant chevalier was alive or dead. But if he should come, he would certainly keep Tandakora from burning him at the stake. Tayoga did not fear death, and he knew that he could withstand torture. No torture can last forever, and when his soul passed he would merely go to the great shining star of which Tododaho lived. But Tayoga did not want to die as far as life here was concerned. He was merely at the beginning of the chapter. So many things were begun and nothing was finished. Nor did he want to die at the hands of Tandakora and allow his enemy to have a triumph that would always be sweet to the soul of the fierce Ojibway. He saw many reasons why he did not wish yet to go to Tododaho's great and shining star, despite the perfection of an eternal existence there, and casting away the doubts that assailed him. He had hoped resolutely. Tandakora had been regarding him with grim satisfaction. It may be that he read some of the thoughts passing in the mind of the Onondaga as he said, "You look for your white friends, Tayoga, but you do not see them, nor will they come. Do you want to know why?" "Why, Tandakora?" said Tayoga. "Because they're dead in the battle back there toward Andiatarocte. Daganoweda, the Mohawk, was slain. His scalp is hanging in the belt of a Potawatomi, who is now with Dieskau. Black Rifle will roam the forest no more. He was killed by my own men, and the wolves have eaten his body. The hunter Willet was taken alive, but he perished at the stake. He was a very strong man, and he burned nearly a whole day before the spirit left him. The ranger, Rogers, whom you call the Mountain Wolf, was killed in combat, and the wolves have eaten his body, too. Now I know, Tandakora, said the Onondaga, that you are a liar as well as a savage and a murderer. Great Bear lives, Daganoweda lives, and the Mountain Wolf and the Black Rifle live, too. St. Luc was defeated in the battle, and he has gone to join Dieskau at Crown Point. Else he would be here. I see into your black heart, Tandakora. I see there's nothing but lies. The eyes of the huge savage once more shot dark fire, and he lifted his hand, but once again he controlled himself. Though the taunts of Tayoga had gone in deep, and they stung like barbs, then, feeling that the talk was not in his favor, but the situation all to his liking, he turned away and gave orders to his warriors. They formed instantly in a single file, Tayoga near the center, Tandakora just behind him, and marched swiftly toward the north. The Onondaga knew that their course would not bring them to Crown Point, which now lay more toward the east, nor was it likely they would go there. Dieskau and the French officers would scarcely allow him to be burned in their camp, and Tandakora would keep away from it until his hideous work was done. Now Tayoga, despite his cynicism and apparent indifference, was all watchfulness. He knew that, for the present, any attempt to escape was hopeless, but he wished to observe the country through which he was passing, and see everything pertaining to it as far as the eye could reach. It was always well to know where one was, and he had been taught from infancy to observe everything, practice being of one of the important conditions of life in the wilderness. The soul of Tandakora, who walked just behind him, was full of savage joy. It was true that Lennox had escaped, but Tayoga was an important capture. He was of a powerful family of the Onondagas, whom the Ojibway hated. Despite his youth, his fame as a warrior was already great, and in destroying him, Tandakora would strike both at the Haudenosaunee and the white people who were his friends. Truly, it had been the Ojibway's lucky day. As they went on, Tandakora's belief that it was his day of days became a conviction. Perhaps they would yet find Lennox, who had taken to such swift flight, and before the sunset they would burn the two friends together. His black heart was full of joy as he laughed in silence, and to himself. In the forest to his right a bird sang, sweet, piercing note, and he thought the shoulders of the captive in front of him quivered for a single instant. And well they might quiver. It was a splendid world to leave amid fire and pain, and the sweet, piercing note of the bird would remain Tayoga of all the things he was going to lose. There was no pity in the heart of Tandakora. He was a savage, and he could never be anything but a savage. He might admire the fortitude with which Tayoga would endure the torture, but he would have no thoughts of remitting on that account. The bird sang again, or at least another like it, because it was exactly the same sweet, piercing note. But now Tandakora did not see the shoulders of the Onondaga quiver. Doubtless, after the first stab of pain that the bird had brought him, he had steeled himself to its renewal. Tandakora would soon see how the Onondaga could stand the fire. The test should be thorough and complete. The Ojibway chieftain was a master artist upon such occasions, and as he controlled the march, he thought of many pleasant little ways in which he could try the steel of Tayoga's nature. The captive certainly had shown no signs of shrinking so far, and Tandakora was glad of it. The stronger the resistance, the longer and the more interesting would be the test. The Ojibway had in mind a certain little valley a few miles further to the north, a secluded place where a leader of men like him could do as he pleased without the fear of interruption. Already he was exulting over the details, and to him, breathing the essence of triumph. The wilderness was as beautiful as it had ever been to Robert and Tayoga, though perhaps in a way that was peculiarly his own. Unlike Tayoga, he had heard a little of the outside world, and he cared nothing at all for it. His thoughts never went beyond the forest, and the customs of savage ancestors were his. What he intended to do they had often done, and the tribe thought it right and proper. In half an hour Tayoga will be at the place appointed, he said. No answer, you said. I would die at your hand, but there's only a half an hour left in which to make good the prophecy. Still no answer. Tododaho, the patron saint of the Onondagas, is hidden on his star, which is now on the other side of the world, and he cannot help you. And still no answer. Does not fear strike into your heart, Tayoga? The flames that will burn you are soon to be lighted. You are young, but a boy. You are not a seasoned warrior, and you will not be able to bear it. Tayoga laughed aloud, a laugh full and hearty. I have heard frogs croak in the muddy edges of a pond, he said. I could not tell what they meant, but there was as much sense in their voices as in yours, Tandakora. Ah, at last you found your tongue, youth of the Onondagas. You have heard the frogs croak, but your voice at the stake will sound like theirs. The flames shall not be lighted around me, Tandakora. How do you know? Tododaho has whispered in my ear the promise that he will save me. Twice he has whispered it to me as we marched. Tododaho in life was no warrior of the Ojibways, said Tandakora, and since he passed away, he is no god of ours. He whispers, if he has whispered at all to you, are false. There is less than half an hour in which you can be saved, and Manitou himself would not need all that time. Tayoga gave him a scornful look. Tandakora was talking sacrilege, but he had no right to expect anything else from a savage Ojibway. He refused to reply. They came presently to the little valley that Tandakora had in mind, an open place with a tree in the center, and much dead wood scattered about. Tayoga knew instinctively that this was their destination, and his heart would have sunk within him had it not been for the whispers of Tododaho that he had heard on the march. The Ojibway gave the word, and the file of the warriors stopped. The hills enclosing the valley were much higher on the right than elsewhere, and touching Tayoga on the arm, he said, "Walk with me to the crest there." Tayoga, without a word, walked with him, while the other warriors stood watching, musket or rifle in hand. The Onondaga's wrists were bound behind him. He knew that he did not have the slightest chance of escape. Even if he made a sudden dash into the woods, he would be shot down before he went a dozen steps, and his pride and will restrained that body that was eager for the trial. They reached the crest, and Tayoga saw that the hill itself rose from a high plateau. Where he gazed toward the east, he saw a vast expanse of green wilderness. Beyond it, a ribbon of silver, and beyond the silver, high green mountains, outlined sharply against a sky of clear blue. "Onondaga," said Tandakora. "Yes, it is the Great Lake," said Tayoga. "And if you will turn and look in the other direction, you will see where Andiatarocte lies," said Tandakora. "There are greater lakes to the west, some so vast they are as big as the white man's ocean, but there's none more beautiful than these. Think, Tayoga, that when you stand here upon this hill, you will have Onondaga one side of you and Andiatarocte on the other, and all the country between is splendid, every inch of it. Look your full, Tayoga. I brought you here that you might see that this might be your last sight before you go to your Tododaho on his star." The Onondaga knew the Ojibway was taunting him. That torture had begun. Tandakora intended to contrast the magnificent world from which he intended to send him, with the black death that awaited him so soon. But the dauntless youth appeared not to know. "The lakes I have seen many times," he said. "They are, as you truly call them, grand and beautiful, and they are the rightful property of the Hodenosaunee, the great league to which my nation belongs. I shall come to see them many more times all through my life, and when I am old man of 90 summers and winters, I shall lay myself down on the high shore of Andiatarocte and close my eyes while Tododaho bears my spirit away to his star." It is possible that Tandakora's eyes expressed a fleeting admiration. Savage and treacherous as he was, he respected courage, and the Onondaga had not shown the slightest trace of fear. Instead, he spoke calmly of a long life to come, as if the shadow of death were not hovering near at that moment. "Look again," he said. "Look all around the circle of the world as far as your eyes can reach. It may help you half an hour from now, when you are in flames, to remember the cool green forest. And I tell you, too, Tayoga, that your white friend Lennox, the one whom you call Dagaeoga, shall soon follow you into the other world, and by the same flaming path, when you are but ashes, which will be by the setting of the sun. My warriors will take him up his trail, and he cannot escape us." "Dagaeoga will live long, even as I do," said Tayoga calmly. "His summers and winters will be 90 each, even as mine. Tododaho has whispered that to me also, and the whispers of Tododaho are never false." Tandakora turned back to the valley, motioning to his captive to descend, and Tayoga obeyed without resistance. The glen was secluded, just suited to his purpose, which required time, and he did not wish the Frenchman, St. Luc, to come upon him suddenly and interfere with the pleasure that he anticipated. He was quite sure that the forest was empty of everything save himself, though he heard again and for the third time the note of the bird, piercing and sweet and trilling among the bushes. The warriors, knowing what was to be done, were doing it already, having piled many pieces of dead wood around the trunk of the tree in the center of the opening. Two had cut shavings with their hunting knife, and one stood ready with flint and steel. "Do you not tremble, Tayoga?" asked the Ojibway. Many of the old and seasoned warriors had not been able to endure the fire without a groan. "You shall not hear any groan from me," replied Tayoga, "because I shall not be standing among the flames. There is no way to escape them. Even now the pile is built, and the warrior is ready with flint and steel to make the sparks." High, thrillingly sweet came the voice of the bird in the bushes, and Tayoga suddenly leaped with all his might against the great chest of Tandakora. Vast as was the strength of the Ojibway, he was thrown back by his feet by the violent and unexpected impact, and as he fell, Tayoga, leaping lightly away, ran like a deer through the bushes. The warrior in the valley uttered a shout, but the reply was a shattering volley, before which half of them fell. Tandakora understood at once. If he had the mind and heart of a savage, he also had the craft and cunning of one whose life was incessantly in danger. Instead of springing up, he rolled from the crest of the hill, then rising to a stooping position, darted away at an incredible speed through the forest. Rangers and Mohawks, Robert, Daganoweda, Willet, Black Rifle, and Rogers at their head, burst into the glen, and the Mohawks began the pursuit of Tandakora's surviving warriors, who had followed their leader in his flight. But Robert turned back to meet Tayoga and cut the thongs from his wrist. "Thank you, Dagaeoga," said the Onondaga. "You came in time." "Yes, they were making ready a half hour more, and we should have been too late. But you knew that we were coming, Tayoga." "Yes, I heard the bird sing thrice, but I knew the bird was in the throat of the Great Bear. I will say this, though, to you, Dagaeoga, that I have heard many birds sing and sing sweetly, but never any so sweetly as the one that sang thrice in the throat of the Great Bear." "Oh, it's not hard for me to believe you," said Robert, smiling, "and I can tell you in turn, Tayoga, that your patron saint, Tododaho, must in very truth have watched over you, because when I heard your warning cry and took flight, hoping for a chance later on to rescue you, I ran within 2 hours straight into the camp of the Rangers and the Mohawks. You can easily surmise how glad I was to see them, and how quickly we followed Tandakora." "And we'd have attacked sooner," said Willet, "but we could not get all our force in time. We've annihilated this band, but I'm sure we did not get Tandakora. He fled like the wind, and we'll have to settle accounts with him some other day." "It was not possible for Tandakora to fall before your arms today," said Tayoga. "Why not?" asked Willet curiously. "It is reserved for him to die by my hand, though the time is yet far off. I know it because Tododaho whispered it to me more than once today. Let him go now, but his hour will surely come." "You may be right, Tayoga. I'm not one to question your prophecies, but it is not wise for us to continue the pursuit of him, as we have other things to do. We destroyed the forces of St. Luc in the battle, but he escaped with some of his men to Crown Point, and there's still Indian warriors in the forest, though we mean to continue skirmishing and scouting up to the walls of Crown Point or until we meet Dieskau's army on the march." Words of approval came from the fierce Daganoweda, who stood by, listening. The young Mohawk chieftain, in the midst of a great and terrible war, was living the life he loved. The keepers of the Eastern Gate were taking revenge for Quebec, their lost Tandakora, and he and his warriors could boast already of more than one victory. Around him, too, stood the white allies whom he respected and admired most. Black Rifle, Willet, Rogers, and Tayoga, the youth of golden speech. Willet, looking at him, read his mind. "What do you say, Daganoweda?" he asked. "Now that Tayoga and Tayoga have been recovered, shall we go back and join the army of Waraiyageh, or shall we knock on the walls of the Crown Point?" "The time to turn back has not yet come," replied the Mohawk. "You must know all about the army of Dieskau before we return to Waraiyageh." Willet laughed. "I knew that would be your reply," he said. "I merely asked in order to hear you speak the words. And as I've already said, it's in my mind to go on toward Crown Point, and I know Rogers feels that way too. But I think we'd first better rest and refresh ourselves a bit. Although Tayoga won't admit it, food and an hour or two of ease here in the very valley where they meant to burn him alive will do him a power of good." After throwing out competent sentinels, they lighted a fire by the very tree to which Tandakora meant to bind Tayoga for the flames, and broiled venison over the coals. They also had bread and samp, which were most welcome, and the whole force ate with great zest. The warriors, in their flight, had dropped Tayoga's bow and quiver of arrows, and their recovery gave him keen delight, though he said little as he strapped them over his shoulder. They spent 2 hours in the valley, and for the Onondaga the air was full of good spirits that watched over him. The dramatic and extraordinary change occurring in a few minutes made an ineffaceable impression upon the mind that saw meaning in everything. Here was a glen in which he had been held by Tandakora and his most deadly enemies, and there was that lone tree against which they had already heaped the fuel for burning him alive. Such a sudden and marvelous chance could not have come if it were not in the special favor of both Tododaho and Areskoui. Secure in his belief that he was protected by the mighty of their stars, he waited the future with supreme confidence. End of chapter 13. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 14, Part 1 of The Rulers of the Lakes by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 14, Sharp Sword, Part 1. The Rangers and the Mohawks had suffered a further thinning in the last conflict with St. Luc, but there was still a formidable body, not so much through numbers as through skill, experience, courage, and quality of leadership. There was not one among them who was not eager to advance toward Crown Point and hazard every peril. But they were too wise in wilderness ways not to have a long and anxious council before they started, as there was nothing to be gained and much to be lost by throwing away lives in reckless attempts. They decided at last on a wide curve to the west in order that they might approach Crown Point from the north, where they would be least suspected. They decided also that they would make most of the journey by night, when they would be better hidden from wandering warriors. So concluding, they remained in the glen much longer than they had intended, and the delay was welcome to Robert, whose nervous system needed much restoration after the tremendous exertions, the hopes and fears of recent days. But he was able to imitate the Onondaga calm. He spread his blanket on the turf, lay down upon it, and lowered his eyelids. He had no intention of going to sleep, but he put himself into that drowsy state of calm akin to the Hindu's nirvana, By an effort of the will he calmed every nerve and refused to think of the future. He merely breathed and saw in a dim way the things about him, compelling his soul to stay a while in peace. Most of the rangers and Mohawks were lying in the same stillness. Stern experience had taught them to take rest and make the most of it when they could find it. Only the watchful sentinels at the rim of the valley and beyond stirred, and their moccasins made no sound as they slid among the bushes, looking and listening with all their eyes and ears for whatever may come. The sun was sunk far in the western heavens, tinting with gold the surface of both lakes. For the rulership of which the nations fought, and the outlining the mountains, crests, and ridges, sharp and clear against a sky of amazing blue. Yet so vast was the wilderness, and so little had been touched by man, that the armies were completely hidden in it, and neither Dieskau nor Johnson yet knew what movement the other intended. The east was already dim with the coming twilight when the three leaders stood up and, prearranged signal, beckoned to their men. Scarcely a word was spoken, but everyone looked to his arm. The sentinels came in, and the whole force, now in double file, marched swiftly toward the north, but inclining also to the east. Robert and Tayoga were side by side. "I owe thee many thanks, Dagaeoga," said the Onondaga. "Oh, you owe me nothing," said Robert. "I but paid an installment on a debt." Then they spoke no more for a long time, because there was nothing to say, and because the band was now moving so fast that all their breath was needed for muscular effort. The sun went down in a sea of golden clouds. Then red fire burned for a little while at the rim of the world, and, when it was gone, a luminous twilight, which by and by faded into darkness, came in its place. But the band in double file speed on through the dusk. Daganoweda, who knew the way, was at the head, and so skillful were they that no stick crackled or no leaf rustled as they passed. Mile after mile they flitted on, over hill and valley and through the deep woods. Far in the night they stopped to drink at a little clear brook that ran down to Lake Champlain, but no other halt was made until the dawn broke over a vast silver sheet of water and high green mountains beyond. "Onondaga," said Tayoga. "And a great lake it is," said Robert, who had a naval encounter on it once. "And now we have a battle too on George. But the French and their allies hold all of Onondaga, while we only dispute the possession of Andiatarocte. They will we've lost still. It's hard to see the French take the lead from us. We dance to their tune." "Dave," said Rogers, "I see a whole fleet of Indian canoes far down the lake beyond Crown Point. One can see many miles in such a clear air as this, and I'm sure they're canoes, though they look like little black dots crawling on the water. Take the glasses and have a look." Willet held the glasses to his eyes a long time, and when he took them down he said with confidence: "Well, they're canoes, 100 of them at least, and while they hold complete command of the lake, it didn't seem natural that so many of them should be in a fleet away down there below the French fort. It means something unusual. What do you think, Tayoga?" "Perhaps Dieskau is already on the march," said the Onondaga. "The glories that St. Luc, Dumas, Ligneris, and the others won at Duquesne will not let him sleep. He would surpass them. He would repeat on the shores of Andiatarocte what they did so triumphantly by the ford of the Monongahela." "Thunderation!" exclaimed Rogers. "The boy might be right. They may even now stealing a march on us. If our army down below should be wiped out as Braddock's was, then we may never recover." Robert, who could not keep from hearing all the talk, listened to it with dismay. He had visions of Johnson's army of untrained militia attacked suddenly by French veterans and a huge force of Indians. It would be like the spring of a monstrous beast out of the dark, and defeat, perhaps complete destruction for his own, would be the result. But his courage came back in an instant. The surprise could not be carried out so long as the band to which he belonged was in existence. "I think," said Willet, "that we'd better go south along the shore of the lake, and approach as near to the fort as we dare. Then Daganoweda and half a dozen of his best warriors will scout under its very walls. You care for the task, Daganoweda?" The eyes of the young Mohawk chieftain glittered. Willet had judged him aright. It would be no task for him. It would be instead a labor of pleasure. In 15 minutes he was off with his warriors, disappearing like shadows in the undergrowth. And Robert knew that whatever report Daganoweda might bring back, it would not only be true, but full. The main band followed, though far more slowly, keeping well back from the lake, that no Indian eye might catch their presence in the woods, but able, nevertheless, to observe for immense distances everything that passed on the vast silver sheet of water. Rogers observed once more the fleet of Indian canoes rowing southward, and he and Willet were firmer than ever in their belief that it indicated some measure of importance. Their own march through the woods was peaceful. They frightened no game from their path, indicating that the entire region had been hunted over thoroughly by the great force that had lain at Crown Point, and after a while they passed a point parallel to the fort, though several miles to westward. Willet, Tayoga, and Robert looked for the traces of bands or hunters, but found none. Apparently the forest had been deserted by the enemy for some days, and their alarming belief was strengthening anew. 4 miles further on they were to meet Daganoweda and his warriors at a tiny silver pond among the hills, and now they hurried their march. "I am thinking," said Robert, "that Daganoweda will be there first, waiting with a tale to tell." "All signs point to it," said Tayoga. "It is well that we come north on this scouting expedition, because we too may have something to say when we return to Waraiyageh. You know this pond at which we are to meet?" "Yes, it's in the hills, and the forest is thick all about it. Often Onondaga Mohawks have met there to take counsel, the one with the other." In another hour they were at the pond, and they found the Mohawk chieftain and his men sitting at its edge. "Well, Daganoweda," said Willet, "is it as we thought?" Daganoweda rose and waved his hand significantly toward the south. "Dieskau with his army has gone to fall upon Waraiyageh," he said. "We went close up to the walls, and we even heard talk. The French and warriors were eager to advance, and so were their leaders. It was said that St. Luc, whom we call Sharp Sword, urged them most, and the larger part of his great force soon started in canoes. A portion of it he left at Ticonderoga, and the rest is going on. They intend to take the fort called Lyman, that the English and Americans have built, and then to fall upon Waraiyageh." "It is for us to reach Waraiyageh first," said Willet quietly, "and we will. God knows there is a great need of our doing it. If Johnson's army is swept away, then Albany will fall. The Hodenosaunee, under terrific pressure, might be induced to turn against us. The province of New York would be ravaged with fire and the scalping knife." "But we will reach Waraiyageh and tell him," said Tayoga firmly. "He will not be swept away. Albany will not fall, and nothing can induce the Hodenosaunee to join the French." The eyes of the Great Bear glistened as he looked at the tall young warrior. "That's brave talk, and it's true, too," he exclaimed. "You shame us, Tayoga. If it's for us to save our army by carrying the news of Dieskau's sudden march, then we'll save it." Daganoweda had told the exact truth. Dieskau had reached Crown Point with a force mighty then for the wilderness, and after a short rest he issued orders to his troops to be prepared for an advance at a moment's notice. He especially directed the officers to keep themselves in light marching order, every one of them to take only a bearskin, a blanket, one extra pair of shoes, one extra shirt, and no luxuries at all. His orders to the Indians showed a savagery which, unfortunately, was not peculiar then to him. In the heat of battle they were not to scalp those they slew, because time then was valuable. While they were taking a scalp they could kill 10 men, but when the enemy was routed completely they could go back on the field and scalp as they wished. The Indian horde was commanded by Legardeur de Saint Pierre, whom he had de Courcelles and Jumonville, and St. Luc with his faithful Dubois, immediately organizing a daring band of French Canadians and warriors to take the place of the one he had lost. So great was his reputation as a forest fighter, and so well deserved was it, that his fame suffered no tarnish because of his defeat by the Rangers and Mohawks, and the young French officers were eager to serve under him. It was this powerful army, ably led and flushed with the general triumph of the French arms, that Daganoweda and his warriors had seen advancing, though perhaps no one at all in the force dreamed that he was advancing to a battle that in reality would prove one of the most decisive in the world's history, heavy with consequences to which time set scarcely any limit. Nor did Robert himself, vivid as was his imagination, foresee it. His thoughts and energies were bounded, for the time at least, by the present, and with the others. He was eager to save Johnson's army, which now lay somewhere near Lake George, and which he was sure had been occupied in building forts. As Waraiyageh, having spent most of his life in the wilderness, knew that it was well when he had finished a march forward to make it secure before he undertook another. The Rangers and Mohawks now picked up the trail of Dieskau's army, which was moving forward with the utmost speed. Yet the obstinacy of his Indian allies compelled the German baron to abandon the first step in his plan. They would not attack Fort Lyman. It was defended by artillery of which the savages had a great dread. But they were willing to go on and fall suddenly upon Johnson, whom they heard, though falsely, had no cannons. Dieskau and his French aides, compelled to hide any chagrin they might have felt, pushed on for Lake George with the pick of their army, consisting of battalions of Languedoc, Lorraine, a strong Canadian force, and a much larger body of Indian warriors, among whom the redoubtable Tandakora, escaped from Rangers and Mohawks, was predominant. Willet, Rogers, Black Rifle, Daganoweda, and their small but formidable band read the trail plainly, and they knew the greatness of the danger. Dieskau was not young, and he was a soldier of fortune, not belonging to the race that he led, but he was full of ardor, and the daring French partisans were urging him on. Robert felt certain that St. Luc himself was in the very van, and that he would probably strike the first blow. After they had made sure that Dieskau would not attack Fort Lyman, but was marching straight against Johnson, the little force turned aside and prepared to make a circuit with all the speed it could command. As Willet put it tersely, "It's not enough for us to know what Dieskau means to do, but to keep him from doing it. It's muscle and lungs now that count." So they deserved to the full the name of forest runners, speeding on their great curve, using the long running walk with which both Indians and frontiersmen devoured space, and apparently never grew weary. In the night they passed Dieskau's army, and from the crest of a lofty hill saw his fires burning in a valley below. Tayoga and some of the Mohawks slipped down through the undergrowth, and reported the camp had been made with all due precaution. French partisan leaders saw to that, with plenty of scouts about and the whole force in swift marching order. It would probably be up and away again before dawn, and if they were to pass it and reach Johnson in good time, not a single moment could be wasted. "No wonder," said Willet. "If they suspect the advance of this morning force, St. Luc, of course, knows that we're back there by Champlain, as we gave him the most complete proofs of it that human beings could give. So does Tandakora, and they may prevail upon Dieskau to throw out a swift band for the purpose of cutting us off. If so, St. Luc is sure to lead it. What do you say, Tayoga?" "I think St. Luc will surely come," replied the Onondaga youth, gravely. "We have been trailing the army of Dieskau, and tomorrow, after we have passed it, we shall be trailed in our own turn. It does not need the whisper of Tododaho to tell me that St. Luc and Tandakora will lead the trailers, because, as we all know, they are the most fitting to lead them." "Then there's no sleep for us tonight," said Rogers. "We'll push on and not close our eyes again until we reach Colonel Johnson." They traveled many miles before dawn, but with the rising of the sun they knew they were followed, and perhaps flanked. Mohawk scouts brought word of it. Daganoweda himself found hostile signs in the bushes, a bead or two, or a strand of deerskin fringe caught on a bush. "It's likely," said Willet, "that they were even more cautious than we reckoned. It may be that before Dieskau left his force at Ticonderoga He sent forward St. Luc with a swift band to intercept us, and any others who might be taking a warning to Colonel Johnson." "Oh, I agree with you," said Rogers. "St. Luc started before we did, and all the time he had been ahead of us. So we have him in front, Dieskau behind, and it looks as if we have to fight our way through to our own army. Oh, the French are very clever. Nobody can deny it, and they're always awake. What's your opinion, Daganoweda?" "We shall have to fight," replied the Mohawk chieftain. Although the prospect caused him no grief, the traces that we have found prove Sharp Sword to be already across our path. We have yet no way to know the strength of his force, but if a part of us gets through, it will be enough." Robert heard them talking, and while he was able once more to preserve outward calm, his heart, nevertheless, throbbed hard. More than any other present, with the possible exception of Tayoga, his imagination pictured what was to come. Before it was fought, he saw the battle. They were to march, too, into an ambush, knowing it was there, but impossible to avoid, because they must get through in some fashion or other. They now were approaching Andiatarocte again, and though the need of haste was still great, they dropped into a slow walk and sent ahead more scouts and skirmishers. End of chapter 14, part 1. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 14, part 2 of The Rulers of the Lakes by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 14, Sharp Sword, part 2. Robert and Tayoga went forward on the right, and they caught through the bushes the gleam from the waters of a small stream that ran down to the lake. Going a little nearer, they saw that the further bank was high and densely wooded, and then they drew back, knowing that it was a splendid place for an ambush, and believing that St. Luc was probably there. Tayoga lay almost flat, face downward, and stared intently at the high bank. "I think, Dagaeoga," he said, "that so long as we keep close to the earth we may creep a little nearer, and perhaps our eyes, which are good, may be able to pick out the figures of our foes from the leaves and bushes in which they probably lie hidden." They dragged themselves forward about 50 yards, taking particular care to make nothing in the thickets bend or wave in a manner for which the wind could not account. Robert stared a long time, but his eyes separated nothing from the mass of foliage. "What do you see, Tayoga?" he whispered at last. "No proof of the enemy yet, Dagaeoga. At least no proof of which I'm sure. But I do now. There was a flash in the bushes. It was a ray of sunlight penetrating the leaves and striking upon the polished metal of a gun barrel. It means that at least one Indian or Frenchman is there. Keep on looking. See if you don't see something more." "I see a red feather. At the distance you might at first take it for a feather in the wing of a bird, but I know it's a feather in the scalp lock of a warrior." "That makes two at least. Look harder than ever, Tayoga, and tell me what more you see." "Now I catch a glimpse of white cloth with a gleam of silver. The cloth is on the upper arm, and the silver is on the shoulder of an officer." "A uniform, an epaulet. The French officer, of course." "Of course, and I think it is Sharp Sword himself. Look once more, Tayoga, and maybe your eyes can pick out something else from the foliage." "I see the back and painted shoulders of a warrior. It may be those of Tandakora, but I can't be sure." "You needn't be sure. You've seen quite enough to prove that the whole force of St. Luc is there in the bushes, awaiting us, and we must tell our leaders at once." They crept back to the center where Willet and Rogers lay, Daganoweda being on the flank, and told them what they had seen. "Good enough proof," said Rogers. "St. Luc with his whole forces in the bushes means to hold the stream against us and keep us from taking a warning to Colonel Johnson. But the hardest way to do a thing isn't always the one you have to choose." "I take it," said Willet, "that you mean to flank him out of his position." "It is what I had in mind. What do you think, Dave?" "The only possible method. Those Mohawks are wonders at such operations, and we'd better detail as many of the rangers as we can spare to join them, while the force here in the center makes a demonstration that will hold them to their place in the bushes. I'll take the picked men and join Daganoweda." Rogers laughed. "It's just like you, Dave," he said, "to choose the most dangerous part and leave me here just to make a noise. But the commander usually stays in the center while his lieutenants lead on the wings." "That's true. You have presidents with you, but it wouldn't have made any difference anyhow. But when we fall on 'em, you'll lead the center forward, and with such a man as St. Luc, I fancy you'll have all the danger you crave." Rogers laughed again. "Go ahead, old fire eater," he said. "It's always your way, I suppose. You'll want to take Tayoga and Lennox with you." "Oh, yes, I need 'em, and besides, I have to watch over 'em in a way." "And you watch over 'em by leading them into the very thickest of battle. But danger has always been a lure for you, and I know you're the best man for the job." Willet quickly picked 20 men, including Black Rifle and the two lads, and bore away with speed toward the flank, where Daganoweda and the Mohawks already lay. As Robert left, he heard the rifle shots which the little force of Rogers was opening the battle, and he heard, too, the rifles and muskets, and the French and Indians on the other side of the stream replying. Fortunately, as the forest was very dense, and it was not possible for any of St. Luc's men to see the flanking movement, Willet and his rangers joined Daganoweda quickly and without hindrance. The eyes of the chieftain glittering when he saw the new force, and heard the plan to cross the stream far down and fall on St. Luc's flank. "It is good," he said with satisfaction. "Sharp Sword has eyes to see much, but he can't see everything." "But one thing must be understood," said Willet gravely. "If we see that we're getting the worst of the fight and our men are falling fast, the good runners must leave the conflict at once and make all speed for Waraiyageh. Tayoga, you are the fastest and surest of all, and you must leave first. And Daganoweda, do you pick 3 of your swift young warriors for the same task." "I have one request to make," said Tayoga. "What is it?" said Willet. "When I leave, let me take Daganoweda with me. We are comrades who have shared many dangers, and he, too, is swift of foot and hardy, and it may be there will be danger also in the flight of Waraiyageh's camp. Then, if one should fall, the other will go on." "Well put, Tayoga. Robert, do you hear? If the tide seems to be turning against us, join Tayoga in his flight toward Johnson." Robert nodded, and the young warrior chosen by Daganoweda also indicated they understood. Then the entire force began its silent march through the woods on their perilous and circular movement. They waded the river at a ford where the water did not rise above their knees, and entered the deep woods, gradually drawing back toward the point where St. Luc's force lay. As they approached, they began to hear the sounds of the little battle Rogers was waging with the French leader, a combat which was intended to keep the faculties and energies of the French and Indians busy, while the more powerful detachment under Willet and Daganoweda moved up from the main below. Faint reports of rifle and musket shots came to them, and also the whining yell of the Indians, so like to the cry of a wolf. Then, as they drew a little nearer, they heard the shouts of the rangers, shouts of defiance or of triumph rattling continuously like a volley. "That's part of their duty," said Willet. "Rogers has only 20 men, but he means to make them appear as 100. "Sounds more like 200, said Robert. "It's the first time I ever heard one man shout as 10. As they drew nearer, the volume of the firing seemed to increase. Rogers was certainly carrying out his part of the work in the most admirable manner, his men firing with great rapidity and never ceasing their battle shouts. Even so shrewd a leader as St. Luc might well believe the entire force of Rangers and Mohawks, instead of only 20 men, was in front of him. But Robert was quite sure, from the amount of firing coming from the Frenchmen's position, that he was in a formidable force, perhaps outnumbering his opponents 2-1, and the fight, though with the advantage of a flank attack by Willet and Daganoweda, was sure to be doubtful. It seemed that Tayoga read his thoughts as he whispered, "Once more, Daganoweda, we may leave the combat together when it is at its height. Remember the duty that has been laid upon us. If the battle appears doubtful, we are to flee." "A hard thing to do at such a time," said Lennox, "but we have our orders from the Great Bear." "I had no thought of disobeying. I know the importance of our getting through. If our force is defeated or even held, Why couldn't our whole detachment have gone around St. Luc just as we've done, and have left behind him without a fight? Because if the mountain wolf had not been left in his front, Sharp Sword would have discovered immediately the absence of us all, and would have followed so fast that he would have forced us to battle on his terms, instead of our being able to force him on ours. I see, Tayoga. Look out!" He seized the Onondaga suddenly and pulled him down. A rifle cracked in the bushes, 60 or 70 yards in front of them, and a bullet whistled where the red youth's head had been. The shot came from an outlying sentinel of St. Luc's band, and knowing now that the time for a hidden advance had passed, Willet and all his men charged with a mighty shout. Their cheering also was a signal to the 20 men of Rogers on the other side of the river, and they too rushed forward. St. Luc was taken by surprise, but as Robert had feared, his French and Indians outnumbered them 2-1. They fell back a little, thus giving Rogers and his 20 a chance to cross the river, but they took up a new and strong position upon a well-wooded hill, and the battle at close range became fierce, sanguinary, and doubtful. Robert caught 2 glimpses of St. Luc directing his men with movements of his small sword, and once he saw another white man, who he was sure was Dubois, although generally the enemy was invisible, keeping well under the shelter of the tree and bush. But while human forms were hidden, the evidence of ferocious battle were numerous. The warriors on each side uttered fierce shouts. Rifles and muskets crackled rapidly. Now and then a stricken man uttered his death cry, and the depths of the forest were illuminated by the rapid jets of the firing. The sudden and heavy attack upon his flank compelled St. Luc to take the defense, and put him at a certain disadvantage. But he marshaled his superior numbers so well that the battle became doubtful, with every evidence that it would be drawn out to great length. Moreover, the Chevalier had maneuvered so artfully that his whole force was now drawn directly across the path of the Rangers and Mohawks, and the way to Johnson's was closed, for the time at least. An hour, 2 hours, the battle swayed to and fro among the trees and bushes. Had their opponent been any other than St. Luc, the 3 leaders, Willet, Rogers, and Daganoweda, would have triumphed by that time. But French, Canadians, and Indians alike drew courage from the dauntless Chevalier. More than once they would have abandoned the field, but he marshaled them anew, and always he did it in a manner so skillful that the loss was kept at the lowest possible figure. The forest was filled with smoke, though the high sun shot it through with luminous rays. But no one looking upon the battle could have told which was the loser and which was the winner. The losses on 2 sides were about equal, and St. Luc, holding the hill, still lay across the path of the Rangers and the Mohawks. Robert, who was crouched behind the trunk of a tree, felt a light touch upon his arm, and looking back saw Tayoga. "The time has come, Dagaeoga," said the Onondaga. "What time?" "Time for us to leave the battle and run as fast as we may toward Waraiyageh." "I had forgotten. The conflict here had gotten so much into my blood that I couldn't think of anything else. But as I said, it would be hard. It's hard to go." "Go, Robert," called Willet from a tree 20 feet away. "Curve around St. Luc. Do what Tayoga says. He can scent danger like an animal of the forest, and make all speed to Johnson. Maybe we'll join you in his camp later on." "Goodbye, Dave," said Robert, swallowing hard. He crept away with the Onondaga, not rising to his full height for a long time. Then the 2 stood for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the battle, which seemed to be increasing in violence. Far through the forest they faintly saw the drifting smoke and the sparks of fire from the rifles and muskets. "Once more I say it's hard to leave our friends there," exclaimed Robert. "But our path leads that way," said Tayoga, pointing southward. They struck without another word into the long loping run that the forest runners use with such effect, and sped southward. The sound of the conflict soon died behind them, and they were in the stillness of the woods where no enemy seemed near. But they did not decrease their pace, leaping the little brooks, wading the wider streams, and flitting like shades through the forest and thicket. Twice they crossed Indian trails, but paid no heed to them. Once a warrior, perhaps a hunter, fired a long shot at them, but as his bullet missed they paid no attention to him. but increasing their speed, fled southward at a pace no ordinary man could overtake. "Now that we have left," said Robert after a while, "I am glad we did so. It will be a personal pleasure for us, too, to warn Johnson. We may carry the fate of the war with us, Dagaeoga. Think of that." "I've thought of it, but our friends behind us, engaged in the battle with St. Luc, what of them? Does Tododaho whisper to anything about their fate? They are great and skillful men, cunning and crafty in all the ways of the forest. They have escaped great dangers 1,000 times before, and Tododaho tells me they will escape the 1,001st. Be of good heart, Dagaeoga, and do not worry about them." They dropped almost to a walk for a while, permitting their muscles to rest. Tayoga's wound had healed so fast, the miracle was so nearly complete, that it did not trouble him, and after walking 2 hours they struck into the long, easy run again, the miles dropping fast behind them. And now Johnson's camp was not far away. It was well for Tayoga and Robert that they were naturally so strong, and that they had lived such healthy lives, as now they were able to go on all through the day, and the setting sun found them still traveling, the Onondaga leading with an eye infallible for the way of that of a bird in the heavens. Sometimes after dark they stopped for half an hour, and sat on the fallen logs while they took fresh breath. Robert was apprehensive about Tayoga's wound, and expressed his worry. "There is no pain," replied the young warrior, "and there will be none. Tododaho and Areskoui gave me the miraculous cure for a purpose. It was that I might have the strength to be a messenger to Waraiyageh, because if he is crushed the French and Indians will strike at the Hodenosaunee, and they will ravage the vale of the Onondaga itself with fire and tomahawk. Tododaho watches over his people." "The stars have come out, Tayoga. Can you see the one on which Tododaho lives? And if so, what is he saying to you now?" Tayoga looked up a long time. He had received the white man's culture, but the Indian soul was strong within him. Nevertheless, he was steeped, too, in Indian lore. All the legends of his race, all the Iroquois religion, came crowding upon him. A faint silvery vapor overspread the sky. The stars in myriads quivered and danced, and there in a remote corner of space was the great star in which Tododaho lived. It hung in the heavens, a silver shield, small in the distance but vast. Tayoga knew beyond all conception. They were fine lines across its face, but they were only the snakes in Tododaho's hair. Gradually the features and countenance of the great Onondaga emerged upon the star, and the blood of Tayoga ran in a chill torrent through his veins. Though the chill was not of fear, he was in effect meeting the mighty Onondaga of 400 years ago, face to face. The forest around him glided away. Robert vanished. The solid earth melted from under his feet, and he was like a being hung in the air, suspended from nothing. He leaned his head forward a little, in the attitude of one who listens, and he distinctly heard Tododaho say: "Go on, Tayoga. As I have protected you so far on the way, I shall protect you to the end. 400 years ago I left my people, but my watch over them is as vigilant now as it was when I was on earth. The nations of the Hodenosaunee shall now perish, and they shall remain great and mighty." The voice ceased. The face of the mighty Onondaga disappeared. Tayoga was no longer suspended without a support in the air. The forest came back, and his good comrade Robert Lennox stood by his side, staring at him curiously. "Have you been in a trance, Tayoga?" asked Robert. "No, Dagaeoga, I have not, but I can answer your question. I not only heard Tododaho, but I saw him face to face. He spoke to me in a voice like the wind among the pines, and he said he would watch over me the rest of the way, and that the Hodenosaunee shall remain great and powerful. Come, Dagaeoga. All danger for us on this march is past." They rose, continued their flight without hindrance, and the next morning entered the camp of Johnson. End of chapter 14, part 2. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 15 of The Rulers of the Lakes by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kenneth Gaghan. Chapter 15. The Lake Battle. Robert and Tayoga approached the American camp in the early dawn of a waning summer, and the air was crisp and cool. The Onondaga's shoulder at last had begun to feel the effects of his long flight, and he, as well as Robert, were growing weary. Hence it was with great delight that they caught the gleam of a uniform through a thicket, and knew they had come upon one of Johnson's patrols. It was still greater delight as they advanced that they recognized young William Wilton of Philadelphia troop, and a dozen men. Wilton looked wan and hollow-eyed, as if he had been watching all night, but his countenance was alert and his figure erect nevertheless. Hearing the steps of Tayoga and Robert in the bushes, he called sharply, "Who's there?" His men presented their arms, and he stepped forward, sword in hand. Robert threw up his own hands, and emerging from the thicket said in tones which made purposely calm and even, "Good morning, Will. It's happy I am to see you keeping such a good watch." Then he dropped his hands and walked into the open. Tayoga followed him. Wilton stared as if he had seen someone come back from another star. "Lennox, is it really you?" he asked. "Nobody else." "You in the flesh and not a ghost?" "In the flesh and no ghost." "And is that Tayoga following you?" "The Onondaga himself, and he's not any ghost either." "No ghost, though Tandakora's men tried hard to make him one, and took a good start at it. But he's wholly in the flesh, too." "Then shake. I was afraid at first to touch hands with a ghost. But God bless you, Robert. It fills me with delight to see you again, and you too, Tayoga, no less. We thought you both were dead. And Colden and Carson and Grosvenor and a lot of others have wasted a lot of good mornings on you." Robert laughed, and it was probably a nervous laugh of relief at having arrived, through countless dangers, upon an errand of such huge importance. "Both of you look worn out," said Wilton. "I dare say you've been up all night, walking through the interminable forest. Come, have a good fat breakfast and roll between the blankets and sleep all day." Robert laughed again. How little the young Quaker knew or suspected. "We neither eat nor sleep yet, Will," he said. "Where is Colonel Johnson? You must take us to him at once." "The colonel himself, doubtless, has not had his breakfast. But why this feverish haste? You talk as if you and Tayoga carry the fate of a nation on your shoulders." "That's just what we do carry, and in truth the fate of more than one. Perhaps lead on, Will. Every second is precious." Wilton looked at him again, and seeing the intense earnestness in the blue eyes of young Lennox, gave a command to his little troop, starting without another word across the clearing. Robert and Tayoga followed close behind. The two lads were ragged, unkempt, and bore all the signs of war, but they were unconscious of their dilapidated appearance. Although many of the young soldiers stared at them as they went by, they passed New England and New York troops cooking their breakfast, and on a low hill a number of Mohawks were still sleeping. They approached the tent of Colonel Johnson and were fortunate enough to find him standing in the doorway, talking with Colonel Ephraim Williams and Colonel Whiting. But he was so engrossed in the conversation that he did not see them until Wilton saluted and spoke. "Messengers, sir," he said. Colonel Johnson looked up, and then he started. "Robert and Tayoga," he exclaimed, "I see by your faces that you have word of importance. What is it?" "Dieskau's whole army is advancing," said Robert. "It long since left Crown Point, put a garrison in Ticonderoga, and is coming along Lake George to fall on you by surprise and destroy you." Warrior's face paled a little, and then a spark leaped in his eyes. "How do you know this?" he asked. "I've seen it with my own eyes. I look upon Dieskau's marching army, and so did Tayoga. St. Luc was thrown across our path to stop us, and we left Willet, Rogers, and Daganoweda in battle with him, while we fled, according to instructions to you." "Then you've done well. Go now and seek rest and refreshment. You are good and brave lads. Our army will be made ready at once. We will not wait for Dieskau. We'll go to meet him. What do you say, Williams, and you, Whiting?" "Forward, sir." "The troops would welcome the order," replied Colonel Williams, and Whiting nodded assent. Johnson was now all activity and energy, and so were his officers. He seemed not to at all daunted by the news of Dieskau's rapid advance. Rather, he welcomed it as an end to his army's doubts and delays, and a strong incentive to the spirits of his men. "Go, lads, and rest," he repeated to Robert and Tayoga, and now that their supreme task was achieved, they felt the need of obeying him. Both were sagging with weariness, and it was well for the Onondaga to look to his shoulder, which was still a little lame. As they saluted and left the tent, a young Indian lad sprang toward them and greeted them eagerly. It was young Joseph Brant, the famous Thayendanegea of latter days, brother of Molly Brant, Colonel William Johnson's Mohawk wife. "Hail, Tayoga, Dagaeoga!" he exclaimed in the Mohawk tongue. "I knew that you were inside with Waraiyageh. You have brought great news. It is rumored already. It is no secret, is it?" "We do have news, mighty news, and it's no secret," replied Robert. "It's news that will give you your opportunity of starting on the long path that leads to the making of a great chief. Dieskau has marched suddenly and is near. We're going to meet him." The fierce young Mohawk uttered a shout of joy and rushed for his arms. Robert and Tayoga, after a brief breakfast, laid down their blankets and, despite all the turmoil and bustle of preparation, fell asleep. While the two successful but exhausted messengers slumbered, Colonel Johnson called a council of war, at which the chief militia officers and old Hendrik, the Mohawk sachem, were present. The white men favored the swift advance of a picked force to save Edward, one of the new forts erected to protect the frontier from the hordes, and the dispatch of a second chosen force to guard Lyman, another fort in the same manner. The wise old Mohawk alone opposed their plan, and his action was significant. Hendrik picked up 3 sticks from the ground and held them before the eyes of the white men. "Put these together," he said, "and you cannot break them. Take them one by one hand, and you break them with ease." But he could not convince the white leaders, and then, a man of great soul, he said that if his white comrades must go in the way they had chosen, he would go with them. Calling about him the Mohawk warriors, 200 in number, he stood upon a gun carriage and addressed them with all the spirit and eloquence of his race. Few of the Americans understood a word he said, but they knew from his voice that he was urging his men to deeds of valor. Hendrik told the warriors that the French and their allies were at hand, and the forces of Waraiyageh were going out to meet them. Waraiyageh has always been their friend, and it became them now to fight by his side with all the courage of Ganeagaono had shown through the unnumbered generations. A fierce shout came from the Mohawks, and snatching their tomahawks from their belts, they waved them about their heads. To the young Philadelphians and to Grosvenor, the Englishman, who stood by, it was a sight wild and picturesque beyond description. The Mohawks were in full war paint and wore little clothing. Their dark eyes flashed as the eloquence of Hendrik made the intoxication of a battle rise in their veins, and when 200 tomahawks were swung aloft and whirled about the heads of their owners, the sun flashed back from them in glittering rays. Now and then fierce shouts of approval burst forth, and when Hendrik finished and stepped down from the gun carriage, they were ready to start on a march of which the wise old sachem had not approved. The militia also were rapidly making ready, and Robert and Tayoga, awakened and refreshed, took their places with the little Philadelphia troop and the young Englishman Grosvenor. Hendrik was too old and stout to march on foot, and he rode at the head of his warriors on a horse lent him by Colonel Johnson. An unusual spectacle among the Iroquois, who knew little of horses and cared less about them. This was the main force, and the Philadelphia troop, with Robert, Tayoga, Grosvenor, was close behind the Iroquois as they plunged into the deep woods bordering the lake, a mass of tangled wilderness that might well house 1,000 ambushes. Grosvenor glanced about him apprehensively. "I don't like the looks of it," he said. "It reminds me too much of the forest in which we marched with Braddock, God rest his soul." "I wasn't there," said young Captain Golden, "but heaven knows I've heard enough horrible tales about it, and I've seen enough of the French and Indians to know they're expert at deadly snares." "But we fight cunning with cunning," said Robert cheerfully. "Look at the Mohawks ahead. There are 200 of them, and every one of them has 100 eyes. Look at old Heinrich, trotting along in the very lead on his horse," said Wilton. "I'm a man of peace, a Quaker, as you know, but my Quaker soul leaps to see that gallant Indian, old enough to be the grandfather of all of us, showing the way. Bravery and self-sacrifice are quite common among Indians. You'll learn that," said Robert. "Now watch with all your eyes, every man of you, and notice anything that stirs in the bushes." Despite himself, Robert's own mind turned back to Braddock also, and the incidents of the forest march that had so terrible an ending. Johnson's army knew more of the wilderness than Braddock's, but the hostile force was also far superior to when they had fought at Duquesne. The French were many times more numerous here than there, and although he had spoken brave words, his heart sank. Like the old Mohawk chief, he knew the army should not have been divided. The region was majestic and beautiful. Not far away lay the lake Andiatarocte, glittering in the sun. Around them stretched the primeval forest, in which the green was touched with the brown of late summer. Above them towered the mountains. The wilderness, picturesque and grand, gave forth no sound, save that of their own marching. The regiments of Williams and Whiting followed the Mohawks, and the New England and New York men were confident. Robert heard behind him the deep hum and murmur that an advancing army makes, the sound of men talking that no commands could suppress, the heavy tread of the regiments and the clank of metal. That wild region has seen many a battle, but never before had it been invaded by armies so great as those of Dieskau and Johnson, which were about to meet in deadly combat. His apprehensions grew. The absence of sound save those made by themselves, the lack of hostile presence, not even a single warrior or Frenchman being visible, filled him with foreboding. It was just this way when he marched with Braddock, only empty forests and no sounds of deadly danger. "Tayoga, Tayoga," he whispered anxiously, "I don't like it." "Nor do I, Dagaeoga." "Think you are likely to march into an ambush again?" "Tododaho on his star is silent. He whispers nothing to me, yet I believe the trap is set just ahead, and we march straight into it." "And it's to be another Duquesne?" "I did not say so, Dagaeoga. The trap will shut upon us, but we must burst it. Behold the Mohawks, the valiant Mohawks. Behold all the brave white men who are used to the forest and its ways. It is a strong trap can hold them, one stronger, I think, than any son of Onontio and their savage allies can build." Robert's heart leaped at the brave words of Tayoga. "I think so too," he said. "It may be an ambush, but if so, we will break from it. Old Heinrich tried to stop him, to keep all our force together, but since he couldn't do it, he's riding at the very head of this column, a shining target for hidden rifles. Heinrich is a great sachem, and he is now old and grown feeble of body, though not of mind. This may well be his last and most glorious day. Oh, I hope he won't fall. Perhaps he may wish it thus. There could be no more fitting death for a great sachem." They ceased their talking, but both continued to watch the forest on either side with trained eyes. There was no wind, though now and then Robert thought he saw a bough or a bush move, indicating the presence of a hidden foe. But he invariably knew the next instant that it was merely the product of an uncommonly vivid imagination, always kindling into a burning fire in moments of extreme danger. No, there was nothing in the woods, at least nothing he could see. Ahead of him the band of Mohawks, old Heinrich on horseback at their head, marched steadily on, warily watching the woods and thickets for their enemies. They, at least, were in thorough keeping with the wilderness of the scene, with their painted bodies, their fierce eyes, and their glittering tomahawks. But around Robert and Tayoga were the young Philadelphians, trained, alert men now, and following them was a stream of New York and New England troops, strong, vigorous, and alive with enthusiasm. The wilderness grew wilder and more dense, the Mohawks entering a great gorge, forested, heavy, down the center of which flowed a brook of black water. Thickets spread everywhere, and there were extensive outcroppings of rock. At one point rose precipice, with the stony slopes of French Mountain towering beyond. At another point rose West Mountain, that was not so high, but at all points nature was wild and menacing. The air seemed to Robert to grow darker, though he was not sure whether it was due to his imagination or to the closing in of the forest and mountains. At the same time a chill ran through his blood, a chill of alarm, and he knew instinctively that it was with good cause. "Look at the great sachem!" suddenly exclaimed Tayoga. Heinrich, loyal friend of the Americans and English, had reined in his horse, and his old eyes were peering into the thicket on his left. The mass of Mohawks behind him also stopped, because they knew that the venerable leader would give no alarm in vain. Tayoga, Robert Grosvenor, and the Philadelphians stopped also, their eyes riveted on Heinrich. Robert's heart beat hard. A million of motes danced in the air before his eyes. Sachem suddenly threw up one hand in warning, and with the other pulled back his horse. The next instant a single rifle cracked in the thicket, but in a few seconds it was followed by the crashing fire of hundreds. Many of the Mohawks fell. A terrible lane was cut through the ranks of the Colonials, and the bullets whistled about the heads of the Philadelphia troop. "The ambush!" cried Robert. "The ambush!" echoed the Philadelphians. Tayoga uttered a groan. His eyes had seen a sight they did not wish to see. However much he may have spoken of a glorious death for the old on the battlefield, Heinrich's horse had fallen beneath the leader. But the old chief leaped to his feet before he could turn. A French soldier rushed up and killed him with a bayonet. Thus died a great and wise sachem, a devoted friend of the Americans, who had warned them in vain against marching into a trap, but who, nevertheless, in the very moment of his death, had saved them from going so completely into the trap that its last bar could not close down. A mighty wail arose from the Mohawks when they saw their venerable leader fall, but the wail that emerged into a fierce cry for vengeance, to which the ambushed French and Indians replied with shouts of exultation and increased their fire. Every tree and bush and rock and log hiding a marksman gave back. Shouted Tayoga to those around him, "Give back for your lives!" The Mohawks and the frontiersmen alike saw they must slip from the trap which they had half entered, if they were not to perish as Braddock's army had perished. And like good foresters they fell back without hesitation, pouring volley after volley into the woods and thickets where French and Indians still lay hidden. Yet the mortality among them was terrible. Colonel Williams noted a rising ground on their right, and led his men up the slope. But as they reached the summit he fell dead, shot through the brain. A new and terrible fire was poured upon his troops. There from the bordering forest, unable to withstand it, they broke and began to retreat in confusion. The young Philadelphians, with Robert, Tayoga, and Grosvenor, rushed to their aid, and they were followed swiftly by other regiments under Whiting. Yet it seemed that they would be cut to pieces when Robert suddenly heard a tremendous war cry from a voice he thought he knew, and looking back he saw Daganoweda, the Mohawk, rushing into battle. The young chieftain looked a very god of war, his eyes glittering, the feathers in his headdress waving defiantly, the blade of his tomahawk flashing with light when he swung it aloft. Now and then his lips opened as he let loose the tremendous war cry of the Mohawks. Close behind him crowded the warriors who had survived the combat with St. Luc, and there were Black Rifle, Willet, Rogers, and the Rangers too. Came just in time with their stout hearts and strong arms to help stay the battle. Robert himself uttered a shout of joy, and the dark eyes of Tayoga glowed. But from the Mohawks of Heinrich came a mighty, thrilling cry when they saw the rush of their brethren under Daganoweda to their aid. Heinrich had fallen, and he had been a great and wise sachem who would be missed long by his nation. But Daganoweda was left, a young chief, a very thunderbolt in battle, and the fire from his own ardent spirit was communicated to theirs. Willet, Black Rifle, and the Rangers were also pillars of strength, and the whole force, rallying turned to meet the foe. French and Indians, sure now of a huge triumph, were rushing from their coverts to complete it, to drive the fugitives in panic and turmoil upon the main camp, where Johnson had remained for the present, and then to annihilate him and his force too. Above the almost continuous and appalling yells of the savages, the French trumpets sang the song of victory, and the German baron who led them felt that he already clutched laurels as great as those belonging to the men who had defeated Braddock. But the triumphant sweep of the Northern allies was suddenly met by a deadly fire from Mohawks, Rangers, and Colonials. Daganoweda and his men, tomahawk in hand, leaped upon the van of the French Indians and drove them back. The Rangers and the frontiersmen, sheltering themselves behind logs and tree trunks, picked off the French regulars and the Canadians as they advanced. A bullet from the deadly barrel of Black Rifle slew Gaghan de St. Pierre, who led Dieskau's Indians, and whom they always trusted. The savage mass, wholly triumphed a minute ago, gave back, and the panic among the Mohawks and Colonials was stopped. When St. Pierre fell, Robert saw a gallant figure appear in his place, a figure taller and younger, none other than St. Luc himself. The Chevalier, arriving in time to help his own, just as Daganoweda, Willet, and the others had come in time to aid theirs, the Chevalier was unhurt, and while one dauntless leader had fallen, another as brave and perhaps more skillful had taken his place. Robert saw him raise a whistle to his lips, and it is clear, piercing call, heard clearly above the crash of the battle. The Indians, turning, attacked anew and with yet greater impetuosity. The smoke from so much firing was growing very thick, but through it the regulars of the regiment, Languedoc and Lorraine, in their white uniforms, could be seen advancing, with the dark mass of the Canadians on one flank and the naked and painted Indians on the other, confident now that their check had been momentary, and that the victory would yet be utter and complete. Nevertheless, the Colonials and the Mohawks had rallied. Order was restored, and while they were giving ground, they were retreating in good formation, and with the rapid fire of their rifles were making the foe pay dearly for his advance. Grosvenor had snatched up a rifle and ammunition from a fallen man, and was pulling trigger as fast as he could reload. His face was covered with smoke, perspiration, and the stains of burnt gunpowder, the whole forming a kind of brown mass, through which his eyes, nevertheless, gleamed with a dauntless light. "It won't be Duquesne over and again. It won't be," he repeated to all the world. "But if you're not more careful, you'll never know anything about it," exclaimed Robert, as he grasped him suddenly by the coat and pulled him down behind a log. A half a dozen musket balls whistling the next moment where his body had been. Grosvenor, in a moment of turmoil and excitement, did not forget to be thankful. "Thanks, my dear fellow," he said to Robert. "I'll do as much for you sometime." Robert was about to reply, but a joyous shout from the rear stopped him. Over a hill behind them a strong body of provincials appeared, coming to help Waraiyageh in his camp, had received news of the ambush and the battle, and knowing that it must be in a desperate case, had hurled forward relief. Never was a force more welcome. Along the retreating line ran a welcome shout, all facing about as if by a single order. They gave the pursuing French and Indians a tremendous volley. Robert saw regulars, Canadians, and Indians drop as if smitten by a thunderbolt, and the whole pursuing army, reeling back, stopped. Then he heard the French trumpets again, and waiting behind the log he saw that the hostile array was no longer advancing. The trumpets of Dieskau were sounding the recall. For the time, at least, Robert did not know until afterwards that the Indian allies of the French had suffered so much they were wavering, and not even the eloquence and the example of St. Luc could persuade them, for the time being, to continue such a dangerous pursuit. A few minutes of precious rest were allowed to the harried vanguard of Johnson, and now, holding their fire for a time when it would be needed more, the men continued to fall back toward the main camp, from which they had so recently come. The crash of rifles and muskets sank, but both sides were merely preparing for a new battle. Robert examined himself carefully, but found no trace of a wound. "How is it with you, Tayoga?" he asked. "Tododaho and Areskoui have protected me once more," replied the Onondaga. "The exertion has made my shoulders stiff and sore a little bit, but I have taken no fresh hurt. And you, Grosvenor?" "My head is thumping at a terrible rate, but I feel that it will soon become quieter." "Its ability to thump shows that you're full of life. How about your men, Captain Colden?" "4 of my brave lads are dead, God rest their souls. They died in a good cause. Some of the others are wounded, but we won't count wounds now." Robert was still able to see the indistinct figures of the French and Indians through the clouds of smoke that hung between the two armies, but he saw also that they were not pursuing at the distance. He heard no sounds from them, and he presumed they were gathering up their dead and wounded, preparing for the new attack that would come surely. "It was not in the first battle, but it will be in the second," a youthful voice said beside him, and he saw the Mohawk boy, Joseph Brant, his face glowing. "We heard the firing," continued the boy, "and Colonel Johnson hurried forward a force. As you know, we are almost back at the camp now." Robert had taken no notice of distance, but facing about, he saw the main camp not far away. Lucky it was for them that the Waraiyageh and his officers were men of experience. They sent enough men to help the vanguard break from the trap, but they had retained the majority and had made them fortify with prodigious energy a barricade of wagons. Inverted boats and trees hastily cut down had been built across the front. 3 cannon were planted in the center where it expected the main Indian and French force would appear, and another was dragged to the crest of a hill to rake their flank. The retreating force uttered a tremendous shout as they saw how their comrades had prepared for them, and then, in good order, sought the shelter of the barricade, where they were welcomed by those who had not yet been in battle. "Get a fresh breath while you can," exclaimed Tayoga as he threw himself down on the ground. "The delay will not be long. Sharp Sword will drive the warriors forward, and the regulars and Canadians will charge. It will be a great battle and a desperate one. Nor does Tododaho yet whisper to me which side will win." Robert and his comrades breathed heavily for a while, until they felt new strength pouring back in their veins. Then they rose, looked to their arms, and took their place in the line of battle. The trumpets of Dieskau were sounding again in the forest in front of them, and the new attack was at hand. "Keep close, Grosvenor," said Robert. "They'll fire the first volley, and we'll let it pass over our heads." "I know the wisdom of what you said," replied the Englishman, "but it's hard to refrain from looking when you know a French army and a mass of howling savages are about to rush down upon you. But one must, if he intends to live and fight." Clear and full sang the trumpets of Dieskau once more. Despite his advice to Grosvenor, Robert peeped over the log and saw the enemy gathering in the forest. The French regulars were in front, behind them the Canadians, and on their flanks hovered great masses of savages. Smokes filled the air over the trees and bushes, and the forest was full of acrid odors. Far to the right he caught another glimpse of St. Luc in his splendid white and silver uniform, marshaling the Indians, a shining mark, but apparently untouched. "The attack will be fierce," whispered Tayoga, who lay on his left. "They consider their check a matter of but a moment, and they think they sweep over us. But we have hundreds and hundreds of good rifles that say them nay. Is Tododaho still silent, Tayoga?" The Onondaga looked up at the heavens, where the deep blue beyond the smoke was unstained. There was the corner where the star, on which his patron saint lived, came out at night, but no light shone from the silky void, and no whisper reached his ears. So he said in reply: "The great Onondaga chieftain who went away 400 years ago is silent today. We must wait the event. We won't have to wait long, because I hear a single trumpet now, and to me it sounds wonderfully like the call to charge." The silver note thrilled through the woods. The French and regulars and Canadians uttered a shout, which was followed instantly by the terrible yell of the Indians, and then the thickets crashed beneath the tread of the attacking army. "Here they come!" shouted Grosvenor, and laying his rifle across the log, he fired almost at random into the charging mass. Robert and Tayoga picked their targets, and their bullets sped true. All along the American line ran the fierce fire. The crest of the whole barricade blazing with red, while the artillery, which the savages always dreaded, opened on them with showers of grape. The Indians, despite all the bravery and example of St. Luc, wavered, and as their dead fell among them, they began to give forth laments, instead of triumphant yells. But the regulars in the center, led by Dieskau, came on as steadily as ever, and the little group behind the log, of which Tayoga and Robert were the leading spirits, turned their rifles upon them. Robert presently heard a youthful shout of exultation at the end of the log. He saw the boy, Joseph Brant, reloading the rifle which he had fired in his first battle. The French regulars suddenly stopped, and Grosvenor cried, "The French were not withdrawing." Upon that field, as well as every other in North America, they showed that they were the bravest of the brave. Wheeling his regulars and Canadians to the right, Dieskau sought to crush there the three American regiments of Titcomb, Ruggles, and Williams, and for an hour the battle at that point swayed to and fro, often almost hand to hand. Titcomb was slain and many of his officers fell, but when Dieskau himself came into view, an American rifleman shot him through the leg. His adjutant, a gallant and young officer named Montreuil, although wounded himself, rushed for cover, seized his wounded chief in his arms, and bore him to the shelter of a tree. But he was not safe long even there. While they were washing his wounds, he was struck again by two bullets, in the knee and in the thigh. The two Canadians attempted to carry him to the rear. One was killed instantly, and Montreuil took his place, but Dieskau made them put him down and direct the adjutant to lead the French again in a desperate charge to regain the day that had started so brilliantly, and that now seemed to be wavering in the balance. Colonel Johnson had been wounded severely and had been compelled to retire to his tent, but the American colonials, at least those who survived, conducted the battle with skill and valor. Cannon, protected by riflemen, still sent showers of grape shot among the French and Indians. The huge Tandakora with St. Luc tried to lead the savages anew upon the American lines, but the hearts of the red men failed them. The French regulars, urged on by Montreuil, charged once more, and once more were driven back, and the Americans, rising from their logs and coverts, rushed forward in their turn. The regulars and Canadians were driven back in a rout, and Dieskau himself, lying among the bushes, was taken, being carried to the tent of Johnson, where the two wounded commanders, captor and captive, talked politely of many things. Victory became more complete than the Americans had hoped. The Indians, who had stayed far in the rear to scalp those fallen in the morning, were attacked suddenly by a band of frontiersmen coming to Johnson's army, and although they fought desperately and were superior in numbers, they were routed as Dieskau had been. The survivors, fleeing into the forest thus late in the afternoon, closed the momentous battle of Lake George. The French and Indian power had received a terrible blow. The whole course of the war, which before had been only a triumph march for the enemy, was changed, and men took heart anew as the news spread throughout the British colonies. When Dieskau's regulars, the Canadians and Indians, broke into the great defeat, Robert, Tayoga, Willet, Grosvenor, the Philadelphia troop, Black Rifle, and Daganoweda, all fierce with exultation, followed in pursuit. But the enemy melted away before them, and then, from the crest of a hill, Robert heard the distinct note of French song he knew. "Est à la pointe d'Avignon, j'ai ouï chanter la belle, Lalong. J'ai ouï chanter la belle. Elle est chantée d'autant c'est dur. Comment dit Moselle Lalong? Comment dit Moselle?" "At least he has escaped," said Robert. "The bullet that kills him is not molded and never will be," said Tayoga. "How do you know?" asked Willet, startled. "Because Tododaho has whispered it to me. I heard his voice in the breath of the wind as we pursued through the forest." Robert caught a glimpse of St. Luc in his uniform of white and silver, still apparently unstained, erect and defiant. Then he disappeared, and then they heard only the singing of the wind among the leaves. End of chapter 15. End of The Rulers of the Lake by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan.